I also will keep an eye on the waiting room because people are still coming in. Well, welcome to the second of our Council of Conference Ministers Innovation Seminar. We're not always sure how innovative we will be, but it is the vision of the Council of Conference Ministers to share the wisdom, experience, and the knowledge across the denomination, because we know many of our conferences and congregations are doing amazing things that we individually may not know about or may not have experience with. So that's the purpose of our gathering. We also know that the pandemic has placed us in an area where we need to adapt almost every single thing we do. And that means that we really have to work on how we are doing the work that we usually do as church. And we need to support each other in figuring out some of the best ways to do that. Our hope is to gather stories, to share experiences, to have a chance for you to listen to denominational leaders, to congregation leaders, to conference leaders, and to move us forward into ways that we can work more effectively. Today's gathering is about virtual congregational meetings. We all know that for some of us, it is not possible, actually for most of us, it is not possible to have gatherings. I'm going to encourage you, if you're not muted, to mute, please. Thanks. We recognize that it's important for us to continue to do the work of the church, and that our bylaws and constitutions may have requirements about congregational meetings timing and the holding of those meetings. So it is our hope that we can gather together in this way to be able to share with you some experiences that others have had. Just so we can begin, I pulled together a very brief prayer from one of my favorite books of prayers. It's a book of African prayers that are focused on praise, thanksgiving, hope, and trust. So hear this prayer, as I let somebody else into from the waiting room. Hear this prayer for God's care and protection, which I think we all need now and always. Everlasting God, who has existed from the beginning of time, listen to us. Everlasting God, who is older than the oldest mountain or river, look at us. Everlasting God, who carries the world in God's hands, take care of us. Everlasting God, who has fashioned the beauty of each creature, protect us. This prayer comes from Gala, Ethiopia, and may it inform our work as we gather this day. Now, here's how this is all going to function if it all works according to plan. We have 3 panelists, and I will introduce them to you in a moment. Each of them is going to have 5 to 7 or 8 minutes to share things that they have learned or things that they know about virtual congregational meetings. In some cases, an expansion of that into virtual association and conference settings, so you have some exposure to the breadth of how meetings happen. Then we'll have some time after and through the chat during the presentations to be able to respond to questions that you might have. We are recording this session. It will be available on the Penn Northeast Conference website. I will be sending it to the panelists, and you can access me to have it sent directly to you individually at my email address, which I'm going to put in the chat in a moment. I'm happy to send the link to you as well. It is our hope that eventually the national setting of the church will post all of these webinar topics, links, and recordings either on their website under a tab, or we'll help the Conference Ministers Council develop its own website so that you can more easily access them. And you don't have to go wandering about to find whoever's done whichever one they have done. Okay? So that's our hope. Now, let me introduce to you our three panelists. I only know one of them personally, but I've had wonderful conversations with all three of them, and I know they have much to share with us. I want to introduce to you Alex Will, who's from South Church in Andover, Massachusetts. He is a local church pastor and has had experience in running virtual congregational meetings and is excited to share some things with you. Nora Faust is the person I actually know. She's an associate conference minister in the Pennsylvania Central Conference. She and I were associate conference ministers together, and we're a part of a community of practice together. Nora works with a variety of search and call teams, although that's not her primary focus. Lots of committees on ministry, has done lots of work both with congregations and associations. And the third part of our panel is Todd Weir, who's the pastor of First Churches of Northampton. Todd has also had experience with moving into virtual gatherings. And I'm going to allow him to begin our panel because he wants to speak to us about the need for culture shift as we move from gathering in person for congregational meetings to gathering virtually. So Todd, I'm going to open the floor for you.
Okay, well, thanks, Bonnie. Hello, everyone. It's good to see all of you this afternoon. So just quick story. So, we all started doing online worship around mid-March or so. Easter was following soon after that. And we're a fiscal year church. So our fiscal year ended June 30th, which meant we were scheduled to have an annual meeting in early June. And then a whole bunch of things have to happen before that, right? Like we had to get our budget team together and do our stewardship campaign, which started right after Easter. So as we were figuring this out, we were right up against, really needing to do all of our fundraising and annual meeting work online. And we were also in the middle, we were supposed to have a strategic planning report due at that annual meeting. And of course, everything we'd been planning for 9 months was all predicated on in-person worship. So much for that strategic plan. So we repurposed the strategic planning team to really become how we're going to be online in the near future, and go from there. So one of the things that we really found important is to really create a culture around being church online. And by culture, I kind of mean not just standard practices and technology, but really what kind of attitude do we bring to being together at church online, and to see it as, this is real community. This is genuine community. We may be in virtual space, but we're really here together, and to take that seriously as holy space. So I'm just going to mention 3 things that I think were really important for the kind of culture that we wanted to build together in virtual space. And the first is probably the most obvious, but that really to treat access to being online as a really an accessibility issue and an inclusion issue. And so one of the things we did right up front is to say, we make a commitment to get every person in the congregation online somehow. And we wanted people to know that even if we didn't make that goal, we had that goal. And so we put resources to that to help people with equipment if they didn't have it. And we were able to repurpose our church administrator, who suddenly, she used to spend 10 hours a week handling building rentals. Well, we're not renting the building, so what does your church administrator do? So we put her in charge of really being the congregation's IT person. And so she really worked hard to be the central person to help everybody figure out how to get online and assess their equipment or find what they needed or just teach them how to use things. And I think that sent a really important message to the congregation to just state that goal to everyone. That because if we don't do that, then there's always people who I think will start to feel like I was never included. You know, people don't care about me, or they don't care about people who don't have easy access. So I think that was really important. The second piece of online culture for us is making a commitment to zero negativity. And what that means is to not be negative about being online or being on Zoom or the process of being an online church. And um, I'm going to borrow some brain research and couples therapy research for why we do this. Um, they say that couples need 4 positive interactions for every negative interaction that they have to be a healthy couple. So often marital therapists will really work at, upping the number of positive things that you're saying to each other. And if you get down below 2 to 1, that's when couples start to get on pretty shaky ground and fall apart. So think about bringing that understanding into our culture when we're having Zoom meetings and so on. And if everybody's complaining about, how bad it is to be on Zoom and how much they're missing being together all the time when we're meeting, our brains are taking in all that negativity. And in a way, it's like, if we were having our meetings in a room and the paint was peeling and the trash isn't taken out, and it just, it starts to kind of like suck all the energy out of the room because our space is just a mess. Well, the same thing's happening if we're sitting in a Zoom room and we're meeting. We're creating, just kind of negative space in the room. So we've tried to focus on having gratitude for our Zoom room, and in our prayers, just being grateful that we can meet, and really saying, hey, this is where we are. We're so glad to be together. If we didn't have this, we would not be meeting right now. So we felt that was really essential. And, solve the tech problems, deal with them, but don't, kind of dwell on the negativity. And the last thing that we found was really important is we had to go back and look at how we communicated information to the congregation, because we realized, many people get their information by showing up on Sunday morning and getting the bulletin. And you're probably all finding this out too, right? That so really paying attention to all of our systems of website, email, repeating things over and over again, really having an accessible membership list that everyone had access to. We put our membership directory on an app that everybody could put on their phone, so that they can just hit the app, find any member, and either email them or call them directly from their phone from the app. So that that's part of the culture of just being able to really find each other, connect with each other, learning to use Dropbox or Google Drive or some way that we can share documents. And we just found, this is always true that we have to over communicate, but it's especially true now. So we made sure that there were question and answer sessions before our annual meeting, that everybody had the documents, so that there was nothing that was going to slow us down because people didn't have what they needed. And, just running through practice sessions and clearing out all the things like, we knew that there was one person who had a very slow computer, and anytime she would talk in a meeting, it would all garble and it'd slow the whole meeting down. So we really spent some time with her to figure out how she could be online, so that, we don't want to be dealing with that in the middle of the meeting, right? So I'm going to leave most of the rest to the Q&A. I'm just going to say that for our annual meeting, we had 60 windows in Zoom open with a lot of 2 people sometimes per window. So I think we had about 75 people in the room. And we found that we actually had a better discussion than we've ever had at an annual meeting. And I think the big reason why is new people felt empowered to talk. There's kind of a, we're all equal here. We're all in our box. And it kind of gave voice to people who normally would have felt shy. And so people who, we'd had a new member meeting, a new member joining session in May, and those folks all participated and spoke in our annual meeting. And the last thing I'll say is, we were surprised how well the fundraising went online, which was one of our biggest fears. I thought we'd be lucky to get maybe 90% of what we got last year. And we actually beat our goal by 15%. We raised $15,000 more than we've ever raised as a church. And I think the main reason why is people knew that we were committed to being an online church, and that I think they appreciated that there was just a really clear direction. Is this is who we are, this is where we're going, good chance we're going to be here for a year, so let's get it done. So thanks. I'll leave anything else to Q&A after we hear from Nora and Alex.
Thank you, Todd, very much. I think that you have shared well how the culture building, community building pieces are important as we move to a virtual setting. So Alex, if you don't mind, I'm going to sandwich Nora in between the 2 guys, if that's okay, and ask Nora to go next. And please put questions in the chat. We're happy to entertain them.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to see so many of you here today. I am conference staff, and so a lot of what I will share is sort of overarching kind of what we've heard from our churches and how we've heard and walked alongside many of them as they ask questions and move into these kinds of meetings. Here in central Pennsylvania, it's really reformed country from our polity, and annual congregational meetings are more popular than what I grew up with, which was quarterly congregational meetings in a Congregational Christian church. So it hasn't been of utmost importance for a lot of our churches yet to have business meetings. They've moved into varying levels of worship online, but business meetings for congregations has not been a really important thing, except for the churches that were looking to do the PPP loans early on. And a lot of the decision making around that was, we have this one thing that we've got to get everybody together for. We don't want to have anybody left out. So the pastor and consistory members were doing a lot of phone calls to members of the church to find out what technical capabilities they had. They felt like, they knew their 20% that were really techie and responded to every email and all that kind of stuff. But then there was this middle ground of folks, they had no idea what they were capable of technologically. And we have a large number of our congregations are very silver in attendance. And so they knew they did the phone, and that was the 100% confidence they had. So they did a lot of phone calling early on in the pandemic to kind of discover what capabilities were out there. For the churches that determined, we've had some that have conference call meetings. They determined they couldn't meet online, that it just wasn't possible for their congregation for either broadband availability, accessibility in their area, or technology. If 3/4 of your church aren't even into smartphones yet, there's not a lot that you can do from an online standpoint. So they're doing conference calls and they do roll calls to, they take attendance. And so then when it's time to vote, if it sounds like, if they can't do it by acclamation, then they just have to go down the roll of who's in attendance. It loses the confidentiality piece of voting, but they've recognized that in this season that might be the best that they can do. In most cases, churches have moved to online meetings. Like I said, there's a handful that are doing phones, but most of them are in Zoom sessions. The question there about phone-in options on Zoom, most of our small churches, it's not a local number, it's a long distance number. And so if your membership doesn't have a cell phone to call in on that, it's not helpful. It's not as helpful. But one of the questions that Bonnie had prompted us with was a question about parliamentarians and bylaw involvement. Most churches have looked at their bylaws and discovered that if it's not expressly stated you can't do an electronic meeting, then you can. And different states have different rules about that. But if there is, as long as people can hear and be heard to participate in a conversation, like email votes aren't legal votes, but as long as you can participate in a conversation around it, parliamentary procedure, Robert's rules say that those meetings work, and that most of our churches have moved forward with that if their bylaws don't expressly prohibit electronic meetings. I haven't had a phone call yet that said our bylaws say we can't do. Most of them don't address it because they haven't addressed their bylaws since the 50s or 60s. So we didn't have this stuff back then to even say you can't use it. Todd mentioned the communication piece to share news about congregational meetings and make sure everybody had the information. A lot of our churches were over communicating. I don't think that, I feel like I over communicate things, and then I realized that there were still people that didn't hear me. So I don't think that you can over communicate right now. Your website, emails, a phone tree. A lot of our churches, I'm surprised every time I hear it, but it's true. A lot of our churches here in central Pennsylvania still have very active phone trees. So every opportunity you have to communicate meetings, where folks can find information or the papers they need for those meetings. The U.S. Postal Service has come back into great favor in central Pennsylvania. I had pastors that were printing out sermons on Wednesdays. Bulletin, sermon, and an announcement sheet was mailed to every member because that was the height of the technology that their congregation could handle. What we learned quickly, though, was that paper ballot voting that way doesn't hold water. So, they thought it would, but it doesn't. So they had to, those are some of the churches that used conference calls for that. I'm seeing the voting in the box there. In Zoom, if you use the polling feature, that can be confidential or open. You just have to select that in the toggle bar for the person that sets up the meeting. What a number of our churches have had to do because of their technology limitations throughout the membership, they will have a member on a cell phone laying on the table with the person that is actually attending. And here again, confidentiality gets lost in that voting. But when you know there are 3 people present through one person's computer, like a cell phone that you see there are 2 people in, then what they have worked out is using the chat function. And they've just audibly affirmed with everyone that confidentiality is lost in this season. If there's a vote that we have to do that way, then we have to figure out how to get everybody on their own screen. And there hasn't been an issue that's come to that yet. When we have our annual meeting in August, we will be doing a virtual annual meeting. But because we know there are technology as well as broadband limitations in our area, we'll have participation sites at a church in each of our 8 associations. At the participation sites, there will be paper ballots for all the votes, and a board member, that is a conference board member present at the participation site, will turn in the tally from those areas so that we get the polling from everybody that's present on screen, and then folks that are at the participation sites will have a tally person there for paper votes so that everything gets reported publicly on the screen. We have tried, very early we shared across the conference some Zoom etiquette so that you could kind of get it crunched into the first 2 minutes of every Zoom, reminding everybody to mute yourself. Here's where you find your microphone. Here's where you find your video. All of that stuff into a real quick opening kind of spiel. And a lot of churches really appreciated that, so that as people learned the technology, it was an introductory moment for everybody. And in some of the Zooms I've jumped on here lately, they still do it. Even though everybody on the screen has been there, they just make it habit so that when you do have a new person or a visitor, you don't feel like you're having to call out anybody. They just like a welcome at church. They go over Zoom etiquette with everybody on the screen every time, so that it's inclusive in that way. I think that's all I had prepared from the questions Bonnie sent. So with that, I'll turn it back over.
Okay, great. Thanks, Nora. There are a number of questions in the chat box. We will get to them all, I promise. I just want our panelists to be able to share with you first, and then we will open the questions to the whole group in case some of you have expertise that our panelists don't have, or have had an experience that our panelists haven't had. Alex, would you take the floor and go next, please?
I'd be happy to. Thanks. I won't speak too long. Some of the things I was going to say were already said. I had sort of maybe I'll call a more practical list of suggestions, and I'll throw some of them out there and then see what they might stir. I'll also just share for offline that as the moderator of our association in the Northeast Association of the Southern New England Conference. I've also run a Zoom Ecclesiastical Council and a Zoom Association meeting. So if those are things on your radar and you'd like to talk more about those, they have different pieces there. I'd be happy to walk through some of those pieces as well. Okay, so let's talk a bit about why we're here, which is our congregation meetings. Thanks, Nora and Todd, for the things you brought up. Some of the things I will throw in is, and I'm going to speak sort of to this, Nora, I so appreciate your perspective around congregations in which things like long distance phone calls even feel like a stretch, to call into a meeting. And so I will admit, the place I'm speaking to is the place sort of in between. Maybe you're not completely comfortable using Zoom or in technology, but neither are you feeling as though a long distance call to call into a Zoom meeting is a step too far. If I was in that place as a pastor, I might even ask myself and our leadership seriously, do we even need to meet? Whether it's digitally or in person. Yes, of course, we have fiscal years coming up, but, I think, is there a way we can communicate and we can maybe try to push meetings out to see what circumstances we can operate under, instead of trying to force one of these things to happen, either gathering together when we're worried about the health of one another, or trying to force folks into a technology situation that is going to be a stretch too far. So I will admit, I'm sort of speaking to this, what I think is a wide spectrum, but nonetheless, admittedly, it's sort of in between those two. some of the pieces I will add and that we've found helpful is having what we call and others have called digital deacons. We do not worship on Zoom, but this is primarily a term that folks have used when worshiping on Zoom, but we use them for our meetings. And these are folks whose only job, and we make sure they are hosts of the meeting, technically speaking, and their only job is to just keep an eye on if there's a waiting room or people coming in. And as I always encourage them to use that mute button generously. And because some people don't realize or are purposely constantly unmuting themselves. And I don't hesitate to just keep remuting people because, we want these meetings to move on. We want them to move forward. And if there's background noise, it can be incredibly difficult. So I warn folks ahead of time politely that we will use the mute button generously over and over and over. And then if it keeps happening, we'll send you a little note to let you know why we keep doing it. So don't be afraid to just keep muting everyone. If you are meeting, I think people understand that they want to be together, but I think they also want the meeting to move forward. And if we're constantly stopping to say like, is someone's mic up? Just mute people. Just if you open the participants menu, you can see the little microphone moves when someone's talking. I just use that to identify, oh, there's the noise. Even if I can't, I'll just go through and mute everyone I think it is, except for the person I know is speaking. And I will tell you, it's really helped meetings move faster that way, as opposed to, I'd rather apologize than ask for permission when I'm muting people. So don't be afraid to do that. Also, I'll share, we found it's helpful if you have a smaller meeting, you can rename people as a host. So if someone calls in or if someone has a different name on their Zoom and you want people to be able to see names, as a host, depending on your settings, you can rename people. And so that way a number can become a name. And so when that number pops up to speak, or who is speaking. And with that in mind, I know I'm throwing a lot at you, so forgive me. I want to just throw out some helpful things, and I can share these in other ways too. I always encourage people to assume that everyone is on the phone. So that being said, if I start speaking, and I didn't even do this now, I should have, but I should have said who I am speaking, even if I've been recognized, because if you're calling in, you always feel a bit in the background of the Zoom meeting. You're kind of an afterthought when you call in. And so I always try to encourage people to introduce themselves whenever they're talking, even if they're on the screen, so people who are calling in can hear. And as the host of the meeting, as whether it's the moderator or someone else, to make sure you're pausing as you're going through things to check in with people who are on the phone. Yeah, I want to take a moment, our folks who have called in, do you have any questions? Or are there things that you're thinking about? Because it can be hard to see what's happening you can't see what's happening on the screen. So you can't measure that, oh, there was a pause, I'm going to jump in. And often there's another level of unmuting yourself. On the phone, it's *6. So you have to hit that, it pauses, you miss that moment to speak. So really taking a moment to take a sense of the digital room and checking in on our folks who call in. Couple other things. Okay, so voting. I've done a lot of voting on Zoom. I think the best way to vote is to use the raise hand feature. It's under the participants menu. If you're on a phone, you can hit *9. That will raise your hand. I still think that's the best way to do it. You don't have to find a chat. You don't have to type anything. You can do that. If you have multiple people in a home who can vote, or on a screen, I should say, then you have to do multiple rounds of voting. So you need to understand in the beginning, what is the most number of people on a screen. In our last meeting, we had a family of 4 who was on a screen, and they all could vote. So we had to do at least 4 rounds of voting. So every person in that household we knew could vote. And I'm gonna tell you, it worked fine. And I want to lift up, Bonnie or Nora said when we were meeting beforehand, I can't remember which one, forgive me, about when you have sort of procedural votes, maybe approving minutes or things that are going to pass, that you could ask for the no votes first. Because you can assume that probably those things are going to pass unanimously. And knowing that if you ask for no votes and you don't get any, then you can ask for the yes votes, and you don't really have to count them. You can assume the unanimous, because as the moderator, you don't have to ask for abstentions. That's just a polite thing to do. For the record, you abstain just by not voting. So all you have to do is know if there are no no's. You can ask for your yeses, and then the minute they go up, they say it's unanimous, and that vote can be closed. As opposed to sort of doing the, starting with the yeses, going through and counting them, and then going to the no's, and there are no no's. So that can help things move a little bit quicker for some of those things that are a little more procedural, maybe, that are less controversial. Do a test run of voting in the beginning, make it something fun, right? Your favorite of ice cream, I don't know, take your pick. And folks can do that in the beginning. We talked about sharing things in the mail, because again, if you plan on screen sharing a deck, people can't see that if they're on the phone. So you're going to need to share things in advance in the mail. So many things to say. Let me see what else here I want to say. Okay, and I guess two last pieces is, one is that, we had some pretty serious votes at our annual meeting in our congregation. We had probably 150 people at our annual meeting, and we restructured our entire governance, and basically dissolved every committee, and we approved in a week a very large reconstruction of our sanctuary ceiling. So these were very controversial votes. And I would just challenge you to, there are some things you might not want to do that are controversial. I would even say, I saw a vote about confidentiality. I might even go out on a limb and say, kindly, if you're worried about there being secret ballot for your vote, if there's a way, then maybe you don't do that vote via Zoom, because I just don't even like the idea of churches doing secret ballot for anything anyway, because that usually means like something's up for me. There might be circumstances in which you have to, so forgive me if I don't, but if churches start moving secret ballot, I'm wondering, like, okay, what's going on here? There's something happening. So I would say, if you're worried about that, then maybe that issue, does that have to be voted on at this meeting? So don't be afraid of having the meeting online if you feel like your people can, if you can tackle it with the great advice Todd and Nora gave. But also don't feel like you have to do everything in this meeting, and that maybe there'll be a moment in a month or longer in which you can do it. And then the last piece is thinking about this, as Todd alluded to, as a moment of accessibility. There could be people who couldn't get to your building physically, right, who are now able to participate in your annual meeting. And that's a great gift for folks who maybe still hold membership but have moved, or are in a living situation in which they just physically can't get there normally. And now they have an opportunity. So there is opportunity here when we look for it too, that I'm sure we've all discovered in worship. But the same can be true for our decision-making processes. So I'll stop there. Thanks for letting me be a part of this with y'all.
Thanks, Alex. And thank you to all our panelists. If it's all right with you, I'm going to move into chat now to ask some questions. I would say I'll give our panelists the chance to answer a question first, but then if someone uses the feature of raising your hand, which you do by going to your participant tab for your name, and it says raise your hand, you actually can do that. And I think that happens even if your video is not on. So the first question in the chat is, has anyone made technology investments in your building? And what about helping members with loaner equipment? Todd, you're unmuted.
We haven't made any technology investments in our building. We're not broadcasting from our building at all. So, our building is 30,000 square feet of storage right now. But we did make investments in helping people get what they needed as far as equipment. We requested money to the Pastor's Fund so that we could help people if they didn't have an iPad or something, so that we could help.
Good, thank you. Anyone else have a response to that question? Alex?
Funny, I'll just throw in that, we have also, we have the, we're, I hate to call material things blessed, so I'm going to say lucky, in that a lot of people in our congregation have the resources to just say, oh, I have this extra iPad or this extra laptop. And that's not true for many. And so we've just tried to be good stewards of helping people tell us when they do. And so we can sort of redeploy those in ways for folks, and do some teaching. I'll tell you, it's hard to do teaching when you can't be physically together, but we're trying. We've been trying. And the second piece is, and this is a bigger one, so maybe I'll just leave it for offline, is that we have made significant investments in technology in our building, both prior to this moment and in light of this moment. There's so much I could say on that. And so I'm happy to talk more about that, probably offline though, because it'll totally diverge us. But you've made significant investments. Yeah.
Thanks, Alex. And I'm sure that you'll find a way to contact us if you need to get that information from Alex or another of us. Wendy asked the question, how to recognize and acknowledge those who are on the phone who want to speak. And I think Alex spoke to that, and how to count their vote. Wendy, was there enough information for you to answer your question, or do you have other more information that you would like?
I mean, I think Alex gave a good idea of a way to do that he's tried out. That sounds good. Yeah, I mean, you almost have to like either let people have their mic open so that they can just start to speak, or the host needs to reach out, and, like you said, Alex, and check in with people and make sure that, if they do want to comment. So yeah, thank you.
Good. I'm glad we answered that one. I think, Rick, we talked a little about the phone-in option on Zoom as for members who aren't online. That is a problem for people who don't have cell phones, who have to pay toll calls. But it is possible that some funds from the conference or the congregation might be put aside to assist with that. Rick, did you have enough information in response to that question? No? Yes?
Were you talking to me?
I was, about the phone-in option. Did you get enough information about that?
Yeah, the main thing is, for people who have cell phones, the long distance is not a barrier.
Right.
Yeah. And does anybody know if freeconferencecall.com has solved their capacity issues that they had been experiencing right at the beginning of the pandemic? Because there were people who tried using that and it crashed. And this was why they started using Zoom instead, because capacity was greater on Zoom than it was at the time on freeconferencecall.com.
I don't know. Does anyone else know?
I have a couple of churches that are still using free conference call for their worship. I do remember early on they said that it was crashing frequently, but I have not had that complaint lately, and they're still using it. The other thing to note too, though, is these are smaller churches where it's probably less than 20 on a call. So.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks, Rick, for the question. Diane asked about voting confidentially in a Zoom meeting. One of the ways that you can do that is to use the polling feature, and I think we talked a little bit about that. And if you have questions about that, you can always go to zoom.usa because they have a video about it, because I had to learn how to do it. So that's one of the things you can do. For people who are on the phone in Zoom, one of the things that I know congregations have done is to have a teller who receives the text from the people on the phone about their vote, which would be the same as someone counting a ballot that comes from a congregational gathered setting. So I know that that has worked as well. Diane, did you get enough information to answer your question? I'm going to presume so.
Yes, thank you. I'm
Oh, okay, good. Thank you.
sorry, I tried to unmute with the space bar and it didn't work.
Well, you know, technology was giving me fits all week, so I get it.
Thanks so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Wendy also said, I'm not quite sure what Nora meant by that won't fly or you can't do that. Does she mean the bylaws won't allow it, or the technical capabilities of the congregation and the choice to make sure everyone is included rules it out? Nora, do you need clarification about that question?
My assumption was it was about paper ballots, but I'm not sure I understand the question, so clarification might be helpful.
So Wendy, do you have more you can share with us about that?
Well, the question came to me after you finished talking, Nora, and so I couldn't think of the exact things, but there were about 2 or 3 times in your talk where you said, but you can't do that. And I wasn't sure, I don't even remember exactly what, but some of them were technical things. One of them might have been the paper ballots, but I wasn't sure if you were saying the bylaws don't allow you to do this, or you can't do it because everyone wouldn't be reached, or like, I don't know if you remember what you were saying. And
I know I said that the mail-in ballot, like to mail it out, and then have a paper ballot, and then you mail them back to the church by a certain date. And the reason that was explained to us by General Counsel that you couldn't do it that way is because there's no option for conversation around the motion or around the issue that people are voting on. So like there was one congregation that reached out to us because they had folks that were able to be in the meeting but couldn't participate. Like they couldn't technologically figure out how to unmute and those kinds of things, and so they didn't get to vote. They were present, so they counted. I'm using air quotes for those that couldn't see that, but they counted for purposes of a quorum. But then after the fact, when they called the pastor to say, well, I had something to say about that, but I couldn't figure out how to get into the meeting really. So pastors and consistories began to wonder if that would even count legally as a vote, if they had folks that technologically or literally couldn't figure out literally couldn't get in from a technological standpoint. Did that get more information or muddy the waters further?
a little bit of both, but I guess it still sounds like it's up for debate whether it legally isn't the correct way to do things, but you're saying it might not be ethically, perhaps.
Right.
Okay, thanks.
The other thing I would suggest to you that we have a lot of ecclesial decisions that we make that don't have anything to do with state law. So if you're restructuring a committee and you're voting on that, that's an ecclesial decision. When the General Synod meets next summer virtually and we pass a resolution, that's an ecclesial meeting. It's not a meeting bound by a state law. And you can do ecclesial voting and meetings differently than you can do ones that have a legal ramification. So if you were voting to dissolve your congregation, that's not an ecclesial meeting. That's a legal meeting. And so there are different parameters around voting based on whether it's an ecclesial decision or whether it's a legal decision. So that's one of the things to check either with your council or with the general counsel at the UCC. They can certainly answer those questions for you. And unfortunately, all 50 of our states have different regulations about what's legal and what's ecclesial. So it's good to get that information. The other thing I will tell you is that unless your bylaws specifically say that someone can vote via email, you can't usually do that using parliamentary procedure. For the same reason Nora is saying, that people can't be engaged in the talking and hearing and the listening of the meeting's approach. So those kinds of things sometimes are parameters that we need to think about as well. And I just know those things because I'm a parliamentary procedure geek. Okay, that makes sense. Can we go on? We have a question about calling a settled pastor in a time of pandemic. And I don't know if you all were part of the search and call in a pandemic conversation that happened with Mesa yesterday. But that is one of the topics that arose. How do you do a vote to call a pastor when in fact you want that vote to be confidential? And it's the same kind of issue that we have with confidentiality voting in a regular meeting. Some of the best ways to do it is to have a teller tally the vote. If you're in Zoom, you can use the polling feature that can keep all that separate and will actually tally the votes for you. And you'll be able to show on the screen 99 people said yes, 4 people said no, 5 people didn't vote. So you'll actually get firm numbers, and that might be the best way to do that. I know that Mesa's continuing to work on resources in that regard, so I would engage them in further conversation about that. I also know that if you weren't able to be part of that webinar, it was recorded and will be available. Brian, did that give you enough information?
Yeah, I was just sending you a note. Who in Mesa ran that yesterday?
Jeff Nelson.
Got it.
Okay.
I know him.
I know you do. We talked, Joseph, a little about the paper ballots. Are you better able to understand what we were saying in that regard?
Yeah, I have a better idea for that. So the follow-up for it is the proxy, and designate someone as a proxy. I didn't hear any conversations about that.
Unless your bylaws specifically have a provision for proxy ballots, they're not legal in the state of Pennsylvania. I don't know whether they're legal in other places. So if you're looking at revising your bylaws and you want to allow proxy ballots, you need to put that specifically in your bylaws. Other folks from other states, do you know if that's true in other places? Apparently not, Joseph, so you're going to have to check with your state government to see if they allow proxy voting without it being specified. All right, I got to get to my bottom. I think I'm at the bottom of my chat. Are there any other questions before we determine that we're going to close this time together? You can raise your hand or you can wave. Carolyn, you have your hand raised.
What we ended up doing is with our congregational meeting, and this is kind of a blending because we did get guidance from our conference, the Penn Central Conference. Nora and our transitional conference minister, Carrie Call, urged us to go in this direction of holding our meeting on Zoom and using telephone options and all of those pieces. We sent out a hard copy of our congregational meeting packet with all of the information 2 weeks in advance to every active member, giving them exactly the information that they would have otherwise picked up after church. We posted it on various parts of our website. And we felt, knowing the problems of technology in our congregation, that offering Zoom training opportunities combined with a Q&A session, so that people could ask questions in advance of the meeting in the hopes that it would enable our meeting to not be, I don't know, an hour or two answering the same questions again and again and again. Mm-hmm. Giving people the chance to familiarize themselves with Zoom and to ask their questions, particularly with feedback from our trustees. Was very, very helpful. We also, though, decided that knowing our congregation, and I did this with the full blessing of our consistory, to have a mail-in ballot option for folks if they felt confident in having all of the information presented to them, to then mail in their to mail in their ballot, and then we tracked those mail-in ballots. So if anyone appeared on the call, on the video call on Zoom, they were not able to vote twice. Trying to track all of that and not have anyone feel like they were doing more than was necessary. And that seemed to work fairly well because we presented all of the options in the packet for how to use Zoom, what to expect, anything that we could think of, letters, all of the numbers. And we got blessed though I'm of course in the Penn Central Conference, that our church bylaws are very vague in terms of how voting can be done. It does not say that a paper ballot is, or mail-in, and it doesn't mention anything about mail-in ballots. It doesn't mention anything about a lot of things. We had some gray area with which to work. And that made a significant difference for us. But as has been said by everyone else, it really does depend on what your bylaws say. And our church's spring congregational meeting tends to be electing of officers of consistory, and that's about it. Now this year was very unique. We asked them to approve the first part of a building project, but we had to move the meeting date back. We moved it from the beginning of June to the end of June to work out all of those technological options. So as long as we held it within the quote unquote spring, we were fine. And I guess I would just commend really looking at your situation, as well as all of the best practices that have been shared here, and figuring out what your people will ultimately cooperate with.
Thanks, Carolyn, very much. That's very wise. The other thing Wendy suggested is that if you have people on the phone in your Zoom meetings, be sure that the host recognizes the responses verbally rather than nodding your head. People on the phone can't see us nod our heads. So it's important for us to be able to share with folks. It appears that people are in agreement with that conversation. Let's move forward, or to share some sort of response, a verbal response, so that people understand that. I don't know if you all have printed, and Carolyn suggests, and asking people to state their name before they talk. Also a good thing. I don't know if you all know that you can print the chat or save the chat so that you can print it. If you are unaware of that, you go to the chat column and there are 3 little dots, and you click on the little dot and it allows you to save the chat. For this session, you all might want to do that because there are a lot of email addresses in there for how to contact many of us. So I would feel free to have you do that before we close this session. Are there any other comments or questions that you may have that we haven't addressed yet? Because we have no minutes, but I'll ask that question anyway.
This is Wendy. What is the what do people think about recording a congregational meeting? Is that a yay or a nay on that?
In my experience, as long as you have everyone's permission, you can record a meeting. The challenge with recording a meeting is, will you be able to hear everyone? And to assure that people who are on phones speaking, be sure to use their name. Those of us who are on a screen can see who's talking, but those of us who are on phones would not be able to.
Jane has her hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry, Jane.
One thing we learned, and I also learned it at my other employment, which is media, the local authorities here in Lehigh, Northampton County, they really take the Sunshine Law to heart. And they, for one organization, getting after us for recording, even though we had asked permission. So you might want to double check, as Bonnie mentioned, with anyone present or any moderator.
Thank you, Jane, very much. Is there anything else that you feel compelled to ask at this moment? We promise to keep you only here an hour, and I don't want to keep you here longer unless there's an issue that you really need to have addressed. If not, then I, Reverend Dr. Bonnie Bates from the Penn Northeast Conference, thank you on behalf of the Council of Conference Ministry for being with us this day. We thank Todd and Nora and Alex for sharing their experiences and expertise, and all of you for sharing your questions. As I mentioned, this recording will be up on the Penn Northeast website, and I saw a lot of people were sending me their email addresses to send it to them. And yes, you can also applaud, by the way, on your participant list. Thank you all so much. Have a blessed and lovely day. Bye.